Poetry, poetic forms. So the term form is used to describe the overall shape that a poem takes. If you recall, our word poem is derived from that Greek word poema, which means something created, something shaped. And so it just stands to reason that anything that is created is going to have some intrinsic shape, some type of form to it. So poems that can be discussed in terms of lines, meter, rhyme, stanza, these are poems that are called fixed form poems. They are traditional forms that poets have been working within sometimes for centuries. Forms like the sonnet, for example. And we'll talk more about those in just a few minutes. Poems that defy or resist or challenge traditional fixed forms are often called free verse or open form poems. So in our discussion of poetic forms, one of the first concepts that we can take a look at is the concept of stanza. Prose writers, if you think back on when we were reading short stories, or essays for that matter, newspaper articles, writers of prose generally arrange their sentences, their ideas, into paragraphs, right? So poets will often do likewise. They will often group their lines of poetry or their lines of verse in stanzas. Now, stanza is the Italian word, or derived from the Italian word for stopping place. That's what it means. And so that gives us a nice idea, or a very insightful idea, into the purpose of a stanza. A stanza is used to pause and to stop before moving on to the next stanza. So the stanza is to the poem much in the same way that the paragraph is to the essay. So a stanza is a group of lines whose metrical pattern is repeated throughout the poem, usually with an identifiable rhyme scheme. Okay. Now, some common stanzaic forms that you want to be familiar with would be the couplet, which is a two-line stanza, the tercet, or sometimes as it's referred to, the triplet, and that's a three-line stanza. The quatrain is a four-line stanza. And I might just make this observation here. You know, when visually you're looking at the poem on the printed page, if you see the stanzaic form of the poem and it appears to be consistent, in other words, the poem seems to have equal and consistent stanzaic form, that's an indication to you right away that what you're working with is a fixed form poem. Okay, so just visually by looking at the poem on the page, you can quickly ascertain whether or not this is a fixed form poem or whether or not this is going to be a free verse or an open form poem. Again, just visually by looking at the page, looking at the printed words on the page, and looking for readily identifiable stanzas or stopping places. The sonnet. So one of the English language's most popular poetic forms is this thing called the sonnet. It's one of the oldest in the English tradition of poetry. So here are some things to remember about the sonnet as a form. All sonnets will have 14 lines and are characterized as fixed form poems. Okay? So that's one way to know that you're working with a sonnet. Okay, you count the lines, and if there are 12 lines, you don't have a sonnet. If there are 15 lines, you don't have a sonnet. So all sonnets have 14 lines. That said, not all poems that have 14 lines are sonnets. Okay, it's not the same thing, not the same logic. Just like the same logic that tells us all Mustangs are Fords, right? But not all Fords are Mustangs. You see, it's the same principle there. So all sonnets have 14 lines, but just because the poem has 14 lines doesn't make it a sonnet. There is additional criteria, additional requirements for what we're working with to be a sonnet. Okay, so there are two types of sonnets. Let's talk about the first one, the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet. Now, it's referred to as the Petrarchan sonnet sometimes because it's named after Petrarch, who was a 14th century Italian poet who popularized the form in Italian. Okay, so the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet is actually older than the English, or sometimes as it's referred to, the Shakespearean sonnet. So with the Petrarchan sonnet is going to have 14 lines, but it's going to be made up, or it's going to consist of two parts. The first is an octave, which is the first 8 lines. Okay? And those first 8 lines are going to have a very unique and a very fixed rhyme scheme to them, or rhyme pattern. They're going to rhyme with an A-B-B-A, end rhyme, A-B-B-A. Okay? This will be followed by a sestet, which means 6 lines. Now, the 6th line, the sestet, at the end of the Petrarchan sonnet, there's some wiggle room in the rhyme scheme. Sometimes, traditionally, the poet will rhyme the 6 lines C-D-E, C-D-E. But again, there is some flexibility. Sometimes you'll see them they'll mix it up. They'll do C-D-C, C-D-C, or other variations. So there is some flexibility in the sestet of the Petrarchan or the Italian sonnet. Now, another thing about the Petrarchan sonnet is that usually in the first 8 lines, or in the octave of that Petrarchan sonnet, usually the speaker of the poem introduces some kind of conflict or some type of situation that the speaker is contemplating. It might be unrequited love, it might be admiring this woman from afar, which was what Petrarch did. So there might be a problem there, that I've got this love for this woman, she is unattainable, she doesn't know I exist. Okay, so the thing to remember is that the first 8 lines present some problem, some type of conflict, some situation that is more often than not undesirable. And then in the last 6 lines in the sestet, the speaker resolves that problem, or there is some type of commentary or response to that situation that was presented in the first 8 lines. Okay. Now, another term that's not in your book, but I'm going to give it to you, is volta, V-O-L-T-A. Okay, I may ask you this on a quiz, so pay attention. The volta is an imaginary place in the poem that occurs between the 8th and the 9th line. In other words, between the octave and the sestet. It's that place conceptually in the poem where the poem turns, okay, where it pivots, it hinges right there. Okay, take a piece of paper, fold it in half for me. Okay, go ahead, do it. Once you fold that paper in half and you see that crease, right, that's the volta. The octave is the first 8 lines, then there's the volta. It's where conceptually the poem changes. It takes a different turn. Okay, it's the turning point, and then you get the answer, you get the reply, you get the answer, you get the resolution in the sestet. Okay, it's a good quiz question. The volta, V-O-L-T-A. Now, after the Petrarchan sonnet becomes popular, it makes its way to England. We don't have time to get into explaining how it does, but if you take English lit, you'll learn that. And it becomes popularized and immortalized, really, by Shakespeare's use of the English sonnet, which takes a little different form than the Petrarchan sonnet. It's still going to have 14 lines, okay? But the form, the way it's constructed, the way it looks, the way it rhymes, and so forth, and the way it works is different. The English sonnet, or the Shakespearean sonnet, has 3 quatrains. Okay, well, what's a quatrain? You got to remember, that quatrain is that 4-line stanza. Okay, so you're going to have 3 quatrains, 3 4-line stanzas, and they're going to rhyme a certain way. They're going to have an end rhyme that follows this pattern: A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. And then the English sonnet, or the Shakespearean sonnet, will always end with a rhyming couplet at the end that will use the rhyme pattern GG. The poet will introduce a whole new rhyme at the end. Okay, so a quick way, when you're looking at a sonnet, a quick way to determine whether or not you've got a Petrarchan sonnet or an English sonnet is look down at the last 2 lines and see if you've got a rhyming couplet down there. Okay. Another extraordinarily popular and extraordinarily intricate and difficult poetic form is the villanelle. The villanelle will have 19 lines, and it will be made up of 5 tercets. Do you remember what a tercet is? A tercet is a 3-line stanza. Okay, so the villanelle will have 5 tercets followed by a quatrain. So if we're going to do our math, right, 15 plus 4 equals 19. We get the 15 from the 5 tercets, right? 5 times 3 is 15. And then the quatrain at the end is going to have get us to the other 4 lines to 19. The intricacy comes in the construction of the form, but also in the communication of the meaning, or in the conveying of the message. Popular villanelles include Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night," Robert Frost's "I'm One Acquainted with the Night." You remember that one? It's a great poem. So similarly to the sonnet, the villanelle represents a challenge to the poet. And so you might be wondering yourself, why does a poet want to write a villanelle, or why do they want to write a sonnet? Well, it's to a large extent, it's because it is tradition, and more so in previous generations maybe than in modern poetry. There was an idea that as a poet, you should be able to demonstrate your skill, your poetic skill. And one way of doing that is to work within these very intricate, very controlled, very regulated forms. As I said, this is not so much the case now, but as the 20th and 21st century, we see much more open form poems. We see lots of poets writing in free verse. We can have a debate about which is the more difficult to write, and which constitutes real poetry, depending on what you seem to value. If you value those traditional forms, then particularly as a poet, you're going to try your hand at that. You're going to try to write a sonnet. You're going to try to write a Petrarchan sonnet, an English sonnet, a villanelle. You're going to experiment with these forms that are very much a part of the tradition that you see yourself in, and by doing so, you're having some kind of continuity or some sense of community with other poets who have taken on the challenges of writing a sonnet. If you don't think it's hard to write a sonnet, try it. It's hard. It's hard to not only adhere to those the form constraint, but again, as I mentioned here, the part of the difficulty is in conveying a meaning for it. And I took a course as an undergrad at UCLA, a John Milton class, and our professor, we could either, for one of our first major assignments, I remember she said, we can either write an exam or write a paper, or we could write a sonnet. And I thought, well, I'm gonna give the sonnet a go, and so I did. But let me tell you what, very difficult, very, very difficult exercise, and it worked my brain. in a way that would certainly rival the way the brain is worked when we have to write an exam or write a paper. So the villanelle, the sonnet, two very traditional, very intricate poetic forms that we see in the English tradition of poetry. Now, our reading introduces some additional poetic forms, probably not as important as certainly the sonnet or the villanelle, but I just want to talk briefly about a couple of them and not spend much time on them. But let's first talk about the epigram and the limerick. The epigram is always going to be a very short poem. It's going to be very witty or pithy. Sometimes it's just a line, a single line. Sometimes it's a couplet. I like Oscar Wilde's, the famous writer Oscar Wilde. Fashion is a form of ugliness so intolerable that we have to alter it every 6 months. Okay, I think I left out the we there. But that's a good epigram. I'm a fan of W.C. Fields, too. And I always liked this one. For weeks we lived on nothing but food and water. The limerick. The limerick is, you may have been familiarized with the limerick in probably ways that are unmentionable, because oftentimes the limerick is, in its humor, sometimes does include adult sort of humor to it. We won't go into specifics there, but the limerick is always light. It's humorous. The humor is derived from maybe its childish, playful quality, and again to more adult themes. But here's an example of one from your book that I really like. The limerick's never averse to expressing itself in a terse, economical style, and yet all the while the limerick's always a verse. And this is a great example of a concept we talked about a while back when we were talking about figurative language, I think, and we talked about the idea of the pun, P-U-N, right? A verbal pun. There's a great example of a pun in this limerick, because in the first line it says, the limerick's never averse. Now, the word averse here means what? It doesn't mean the verse of poetry. It means that if you are averse to something, you are opposed to it. Okay? But the pun comes when we hit the last line, the limerick's always a verse. So the chiming, the rhyming of the word averse, and then in the last line, the two words, a verse. That's pun, right? There's humor. There's some wit that is communicated there in those first lines and the last lines. And it works out beautifully, because the first line says the limerick is never a verse, and the last line says the limerick is always a verse, right? So there's some paradox there as well. So the epigram and the limerick, ladies and gentlemen. The last three poetic forms I'm going to ask you to be familiar with, again, are minor poetic forms. They are the haiku, the elegy, and the ode. Okay, the haiku is pretty easy to remember. The haiku is a poetic form that we borrow from the Japanese literary tradition. It's always going to have 3 lines to it. It's going to have, the first line will have 3 syllables, the second line will have 5, and then the third line will have 3 syllables. Okay. The elegy is usually a lyric poem that commemorates someone who is dead, and oftentimes poets are so moved by the passing of someone that they've loved, either a personal friend in their lives, or sometimes larger public figures, sometimes political figures. The poet will be moved by the passing of the loved one in such a way that he or she picks up the pen and writes a poem that commemorates the life and the death of someone significant to him individually, or to a people in the sense of a political figure, religious leader, so forth. The ode is always serious and is always somewhat lofty and a bit formal. Remember back when we talked about diction, right? When we talked about word choices, and there was, high diction, medium diction, and and more conversational language. So in an ode, typically you can expect the poet to use or rely on diction that's a little more elevated. It's a little more lofty in its tone. It's generally, not always, this is a generalization, it's generally more public than it is private. In other words, an ode is not usually what we would consider a confessional type poem where the poet is looking inward and is introspective. It's not that kind of poem. The ode usually looks outside of the poet, to the larger world, to the larger public, to humanity, and to those abstractions to which we all, as human beings, can relate to at some level, like the idea of love, the idea of honor, the idea of patriotism, truth, and so forth. So the haiku, the elegy, the ode, be familiar with those. Again, just know what they are, not so much being able to recognize them. I'm not going to give you 7 poems and say, pick out the haiku or pick out the elegy. I'm not going to do that. I just want you to be familiar with those terms. Again, these are poetic forms. These are fixed forms. Usually, in the case of the sonnet and the villanelle and the haiku, the elegy is a little looser. The elegy is not going to be necessarily a fixed form poem, and neither is the ode. Okay. But the sonnet, the villanelle, what else did we talk about? The haiku, the limerick is usually pretty fixed in its form. Okay, so we'll go ahead and sign off for this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope these are helping you at some level process the information, helping you figure out what I'm emphasizing, and maybe helping explain some of the concepts, or at least getting a different slant, a different take on the concepts than just reading them out of the book. Okay.